Hi, Sheila. It's good to see you again.
Yes, you too.
Sheila, what do you know about a book called Every Man's Battle?
More than I ever wanted to know.
Yeah, I was kind of afraid you were going to say something like that. From Religion News Service, this is ApocryFUN, the Saved by the City sidecar. I am Tyler Huckabee.
And I'm Sheila Gregoire.
On every episode of this show, we talk about a popular, influential, or at least lucrative Christian book from the 90s and 2000s. We'll talk about how it shaped American Christianity and our own personal faith journeys, and how it's aged in our current dystopian Christian nationalist hellscape. On this episode, we're talking about Every Man's Battle. Every Man's Battle is a book from 2000, originally from 2000, by two guys named Stephen Arterburn and Fred Stoeker. Sheila, like you said up front, you are very familiar with this book. I was telling you this offline beforehand, but normally I kind of walk the guests through the book a little bit and get their reactions to it. In this case, you are probably, for better or worse, one of the nation's foremost experts on the content of this book.
Yes. So when we did our research for our book, The Great Sex Rescue, we surveyed 20,000 women to find out how key evangelical teachings affected women's marital and sexual satisfaction. But we also looked at 13 of the best-selling Christian marriage and sex resources. And one of those was Every Man's Battle, because the series has sold over 4 million copies.
Yeah.
So we analyzed it, and wow, it's a thing.
Before you had started in on this research and the work you're doing now, were you already familiar with Every Man's Battle?
I recommended it.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
You passed it around. Oh,
I
wow.
held it up
Okay.
at marriage conferences we were speaking at, and I said, this is a great one, because when you're looking at quitting porn, it really was the main book that everyone recommended.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
what I always say to people is I spent 10 years writing about marriage and sex without ever reading what anyone else was writing, because I figured they love Jesus, I love Jesus, we're all saying the same thing, and I didn't want to plagiarize. And so I knew this was a bestseller, and I figured it must be healthy. So I recommended it.
And then did you actually read it? Did the research come first, or the read it? When did you first start to get some questions about the message of Every Man's Battle?
I started hearing from people, and then I started looking into some of the claims around 2016, 2017, and our research started in 2019. So I was starting to have doubts about 2 years before we took on our huge project. And then we read it.
You're hearing things from people who had read it, or you're seeing things online, or just people in your own life, just across the board. You were starting to hear some people raise questions about.
That's right. I had the largest Christian marriage blog. I still do.
Yes.
It's called Bare Marriage. It didn't used to be called that. But I had a lot of commenters saying, my husband's used porn for decades. He's tried to quit. He can't quit. He went through an Every Man's Battle group at the church. And now he's even worse. He's telling me that I'm responsible for him using porn.
It's not funny. I don't mean to laugh. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That is not a great review of this book. And it's something that you do start seeing a lot, both in your research and just as I was doing some research on this book. It's how many people say, well, my husband was kind of wondering what was going on here, maybe was having some trouble with pornography, or just women in his life didn't know what to do, got recommended this book, and it became worse.
Yeah, exactly. And this book took off. It hit a niche when it was published in 2000, and it took off. But what's really important to understand is that neither of the authors had any credentials in writing it, except that they claimed to be former sex addicts.
That's a really, really key part of this whole saga.
Right. They are not psychologists. They are not counselors. Their only claim to fame is that they were sex addicts, and now they're not. And this just took off. The church just really, really ran with this.
I grew up, as people who listen to this podcast know, grew up in the church, very evangelical in the Midwest. My grandparents had a Christian bookstore where all the books that we've discussed on this podcast and so many more were a very big part of my life. Every Man's Battle, I did not read until I actually started working on this podcast. I had never actually sat down and read it, but the advice in that book was just kind of in the ether around me. You didn't even have to read, kind of like The Secret was for people who watched Oprah in the early 2000s. You just knew the rules without having to read. So that the idea of bouncing the eyes became a very popular thing to say at the Christian college that I went to. which has got its origin, that idea of bouncing the eyes, which is like, if you see a pretty girl and you feel like it's tempting you to think bad thoughts, you like literally just kind of like, boop, like bounce your eyes off or somewhere else, which is a really strange and sort of like weirdly comedic and objectifying way to talk about dealing with something like this, but it was everywhere.
Well, that's exactly right. Okay, you used a really important word there. You said that's an objectified way of handling this. And that is the problem, is that their solution to lust and porn use agrees with porn's definition of women and sex.
Yeah.
That's the whole issue right there. They have two basic solutions, and maybe you're going to get to this later, but I'm going to jump in right now. They
Sounds
have
good.
two basic solutions to the problem of lust. One is that you're supposed to transfer all of your sexual energy to your wife. And so it actually says, if you used to come to her for 5 bowls of sexual gratification a week, I don't know why they phrased it that way. It's really icky. Meaning some sort of physical release. Now you come to her for 10 a week. And then they say, and she will like this. She'll be grateful for this. Okay, showing a tremendous lack of understanding of women.
The bowls thing is very strange, and I don't know where that metaphor, they don't even try to explain what that means.
No.
I see this as like Charles Dickens type thing, like Oliver asking for more soup or something like that. Like
Yes,
that's what I picture in my mind. And you have this phrase that you use in your own research that I think is very helpful and will be helpful for our discussion of this, of women, wives especially, as sin management tools.
Yeah.
This is not her sexual gratification, her sexual dignity is not considered important to these authors, this book, or this conversation. It is about her sex as being useful for curbing guys basically just feeling like sexually excited and not knowing what to do with it besides have sex with their wives, whether or not she is interested in that or even enjoys it.
Right. And they don't mention anything about women's pleasure at all in this book. It's just about his release. And they say that word several times, which again is just really creepy.
Yeah.
But they actually, in the original edition, they've taken this out of the 2020 edition, but in the original edition, they actually called women the methadone for their husband's sex addictions.
Oh, I did not.
So they advise women, when he quits cold turkey, be like a merciful vial of methadone for him. And what is methadone? Let's think this through. So when you are addicted to some sort of an opioid, right? That's what you really want. That's what your body wants. That's what your body craves. But methadone is a substitute which allows you to go for a while without actually getting what you really want. So they're saying to wives, hey, you can be like this substitute that can keep him from going after what he really wants. And that's how they see women.
Like a patch, basically, on the actual problem. And in that way, I think every man's battle doesn't even really satisfy its own stated goals of, according to the subtitle, helping men overcome the battle against sexual temptation one victory at a time. Because what it's very clear teaching is that there is no such thing as victory here for men at all. You cannot win. And the best case scenario is that you get married to a woman who will just kind of like stick her fingers in this bursting dam that is inside of you and hopefully kind of keep things from boiling over and keep you from becoming basically a sex criminal until the end of your marriage when you finally die and then the battle's over at long last.
The essential message in every man's battle is, hey guys, you are going to lust after everything that moves and you are going to want to have sex with everything that moves. But God's plan is that instead of you lusting and objectifying every woman, you get to lust after and objectify just one woman for the rest of your life. So it has nothing to do with intimacy. It's just about using women. So I said that every man's battle has 2 ways of defeating lust. The first is to use your wife, and the second is to bounce your eyes, what you were talking about, right? And they even give the scenario, when you walk into an office building, remember that there's usually a receptionist right there, and receptionists bend over a lot. And so as soon as you walk into an office, get in the habit of looking away because you don't want to see the receptionist bend over. And so this whole thing is about bouncing your eyes from women. You're not supposed to look at women. And it's like, you know what, Tyler? Jesus never refused to look at women. Jesus chose to truly see women.
I feel like we're getting a little bit of, we keep coming to important points that I'm going to spend a lot of time on. I do want to lay a little bit of groundwork and context for this book and where it came from. Normally, Normally, we do a pop quiz where I test my guests to see how much they actually know about this book. I'm going to forego that here because I think as I said earlier, I think you know more about this book than probably the authors themselves do. So I'm just going to go ahead and say you pass the quiz. So I'm going to go right to talking about a little more about why we actually picked this book. I'm going to give a brief overview of kind of where it came from and who these two guys are. Please feel free to interject if I skip anything, because you probably have some biographical details that would be interesting here as well. Like I said, it comes out in 2000, has since then sold more than 4 million copies. A few years ago, they released the 20-year revised edition. They got an endorsement from Max Lucado, who I'm sure will end up on this podcast sooner or later himself. Arterburn and Stoeker are the two guys who wrote it. They're interesting characters. Stoeker is a Stanford graduate who was living in Des Moines when he co-wrote this book. He was just kind of like a business guy, a salesman, a business consultant, and like you said, had no real experience with human sexuality, with human psychology, even with Christian ethics. There's a loose reference to him revisiting what he calls, like, I think his human sexuality class he took at Stanford, which I think means he maybe just took one undergraduate course potentially on sexuality, and that was the entirety of his education on this topic. And so he's been very involved in this. From what I can tell, Arterburn is the flashier of the two. He is out in front of the cameras quite a bit more. He's been on Oprah. He was profiled in GQ magazine. He has at times been referred to as a doctor or as a Christian psychologist by other people, and he's never really dissuaded people from calling him that, but he does not have a PhD and he is not trained in psychology. He has a master's in education. He spent a long time trying to break into the Christian publishing industry through several different topics until he came across this one and it made him a star. Like you alluded to earlier, and this is very important, both of these guys talk quite a bit about their journey with being addicted to some form of sex, and that's really their only basis for this. Kind of like a mix of pornography and just like seeing pretty girls on the street and not knowing what to do with them. The book opens with this like kind of unintentionally funny anecdote. Arterburn's driving a car.
We need to read some of that because I think that it shows like where their mindset is, okay?
Okay, this is good. Yeah, help me out here.
So this is Steve Arterburn talking about himself, and here's how he begins it. He's driving his car in California, and he ends up getting in a car accident. He says this: "My eyes locked onto this goddess-like blonde, rivulets of sweat cascading down her tanned body as she ran at a purposeful pace. Her jogging outfit was actually a skimpy bikini. The two tiny triangles of tie-dyed fabrics struggled to contain her ample bosom. My eyes feasted on this banquet of glistening flesh," etc., etc. It's like, okay, these men are trying to tell us that they are reformed sex addicts. But someone who has a healthy view of women and who does not objectify women could have told that story very differently.
Go ahead.
One day, when I was still in the throes of my sex addiction, I was driving along the highway when I saw a jogger dressed really scantily, and I stared at her, my eyes left the road, and I ended up causing a collision.
Right.
But no, he had to talk about banquets of glistening flesh, you know, her ample bosom. Like, no.
It's smut. Mm-hmm. It's not hard to see why a guy who's struggling with some sort of sexual addiction would come to this, and it would make it worse because this is one of many, and we'll talk about there's a lot more of these, of these descriptions of women that go into this outrageous amount of detail about the size of their breasts or what they're wearing or whatever, that make it very clear that these guys are not thinking of these people in terms of their personhood, their humanity. Right. That is not valuable. And you see this is extremely common among men in these circles still. You see this now. It's everywhere on social media, as I know you're aware, to describe women at the office, at the gym, even in church, certainly on Instagram, TikTok, things like that, in these terms that dehumanize them for the purpose of making it clear that they are sort of the enemy in this battle.
And they actually say that. There's a website that is up, like currently a webpage that is up on Steve Arterburn's site where it's talking about bounce your eyes. And it says, like, in the summer, this was written in 2022. And it says, your first step in overcoming lust this summer is to make a list of your enemies, your greatest enemies. And they give examples of who these enemies might be. And it's your female coworkers, your attractive coworkers, or female joggers. So they are literally calling an attractive coworker your greatest enemy. Would Jesus ever do that? Would someone who does not have an objectified view of women do that? And that's my main problem, is that their way of getting over lust objectifies women, which is the entire problem with lust.
There is in no way here is this ever go about addressing the root cause of a person who is struggling with some sort of problem with their sexuality. Bringing a battle into it, as they do in the title, implies an enemy. And the enemy, to any right-thinking, spiritually and sexually healthy person, would be not the women that come into your like line of sight, who are just innocently going for a jog, whatever they're wearing. It's what's happening inside yourself. It is your own issues. It's your own addiction. And that is not made clear in this book.
No, exactly. And this whole philosophy has gone into the wider Christian culture. Like just a couple of weeks ago, SBC megachurch pastor Josh Howerton in a sermon was talking to men about lust. And he says, basically, if you come out of church and in the parking lot, there's a shady little girl in a miniskirt.
Yeah, I saw that.
You are no match for that enemy. So run, Forrest, run. So he's calling a little girl, like a child in a skirt in a church parking lot, a man's enemy. And it's like, no, if you're lusting after her, if you're wanting to have sex with a little girl, you are the enemy, not her.
Yeah, you are A, your own enemy, and B, more importantly, you are her enemy at that moment. You're the one who's attacking her and is foistering in some cases, literal attack on her. And this is a problem throughout, like I said, throughout this book, not only with how it describes women, but also how it describes men's, how they feel about women, what they sometimes do around these women. There are things that are very clearly illegal that would get you arrested that are within this book described as just sort of like men falling into temptation.
There's a super weird one where like maybe you've driven your rental car to a gym parking lot and masturbated as you watched women go in and out. And I'm like, that is weirdly specific.
Very on the nose.
That is also exhibitionism, and that is illegal.
Yeah. You can't do that.
No. And what's really astonishing is how they portray these things as normal. And they never talk about the impact on the women and girls around them.
Right.
So there's one instance, they actually do admit this one's against the law, which is good. It's one of the few crimes they mention in their books, which they do say is actually a crime, which is when a youth volunteer ends up raping a 15-year-old girl. But they very clearly blame it on her. She was flirting with him. She looked older than she was. When he asked her to take down her pants, she did it. And then he was seen as the victim because now, oh my gosh, her parents might report him to the police. And it's like, that is just, we were invited to have sympathy for him because he fell into this temptation of raping a 15-year-old. This guy who was in his 30s who had 3 kids, raped a 15-year-old.
And there is sort of this implication there that is kind of like, there but for the grace of God goes any guy. Like that is this, it's a very understood idea that this happens in a lot of different ways. And in no case is other than the one you mentioned, that is true. I did note that was clocked as an actual crime. But the idea of coercing or even lying to your wife to get her to have sex with you is an okay, natural, maybe even healthy thing to do. And the only time that assault or sexual assault is really brought in as a serious issue is when a guy sees a girl in a bikini that he didn't plan on. And that is considered an attack.
On him.
Yeah, he's being a victim of some woman. But a woman being a victim of man sexuality, this isn't, because it wouldn't be fair to ask men to control their urges. Like, what are they supposed to do? They can't help but not assault somebody.
Yeah, so for instance, they'll say like, you have forced your wife to perform like a porn star. So as you're reading it, they're normalizing this. And they're sort of saying, we all know that guys do this. You force your wife to perform like a porn star. You do, I think that's the direct quote, but you do all of these things that are wrong and coercive and would count as marital rape, and they're normalizing them. And they're never talking about the effect. They have this really icky anecdote of a guy named Alex, I think, who he's watching a movie with his sister-in-law.
Yes, that one was very strange.
Who's, I believe, a teenager, and her shorts are really short, and so he ends up masturbating while she's sleeping right beside him. And the reason this was told was to illustrate how badly guys can fall into lust. It wasn't to show guys how badly you can treat women.
And that the very simple reality with many of the anecdotes that they share here is that these are not normal like if this is something that you are dealing with, then you have a problem way bigger than not bouncing your eyes.
Yeah.
You know, I am aware that these things do happen to men. And frankly, and this is not discussed at all, but I know that women sometimes have sexual urges that may scare them or they may know are not like healthy, normal things for women to feel. And that is not brought up or discussed at all. But if that is happening, if that's something you're struggling with, you need to talk to somebody professionally right away. That is not a battle that you can win on your own just through reading a book. Like that is a serious problem. But it is treated as part of the broad range of sexual temptation common to every single man out there. And the best thing you can do is bounce your eyes and get married as soon as you can to a woman who will, be open to having sex as many times a week or a day as possible to keep her husband from giving in to these strange urges that he would have otherwise.
And that is a bizarre way of seeing sex.
Yeah. It doesn't make any sense.
This is so tremendously unhealthy because then the reason to have sex is not to connect emotionally or intimately in any stretch of the imagination. It's just simply so that I can use your body so that I don't sin and ruin my purity. Because if you read the book over and over again, it is his purity that is being hurt. And he doesn't want to hurt his purity. There isn't a concern for women. And it's like, that's got nothing to do with intimacy, dude.
Yeah, that is not the purpose or the goal. And if for anybody who is actually thinking about the dignity and the humanity and just frankly the pleasure of a woman in their life, that would sound foreign. That would sound strange. It's essentially masturbation just by using somebody else.
Yeah, it's using your wife as a masturbatory aid.
Yeah, like we said, this book by itself sells over 4 million copies, but it also becomes a phenomenon and it launches this like empire of other books that are right along these lines. You've got, and this is an incomplete list, but in addition to Every Man's Battle, we have Every Young Man's Battle, we have Every Woman's Battle, Every Young Woman's Battle, Every Man's Marriage, Every Woman's Marriage, Every Man, God's Man, and Every Young Man, God's Man, Every Heart Restored, Every Man's Challenge, and it goes on, and this is very common in Christian publishing where you have one hit and then you have to kind of like retool it because you didn't actually hit every man the first time, so you got to make it like expand it to get as many people to buy this book and read it as possible. But the material, to be clear, did not read all of these books in preparation for this podcast, but I perused the ones I could find to peruse. It sounds like they mostly kept the content the same, just retooled the intended audience a little bit.
Yeah, the masturbating in a car parking lot is outside a school gym now in Every Young Man's Battle.
That is not better.
Same anecdote, yeah.
So that comes up twice?
Yeah.
You don't want to assume anything, but that just feels too strange to have just been made up on the spot.
Yeah, Every Young Man's Battle opens with an anecdote of, I think it's an 11-year-old boy who he is struggling because he just wants to take off his clothes in front of girls all the time. And they portray that as normal as opposed to someone who needs to get some help. So yeah, that one made me cry. Every Young Man's Battle made me weep because teenagers were reading this and they were being told, basically, you're a pervert and that's the way God made you.
That opens up another line of conversation that I want to have about this here. But before we do that, we're going to get a quick word in from our sponsor. Religion News Service is an independent, award-winning source of global reporting on religion, spirituality, culture, and ethics.
Get the dope on the Pope.
And if you like what we're doing at Saved by the City or here on ApocryFUN, let us know. Throw us a rating or review. Really do. Those things go a long ways towards helping us keep the lights on around here and finding more people to listen to the show.
And if you have some suggestions for books that you would like to see us cover, well, we'd love to hear them too.
You can hit us up on social media. You can find us in all of the places. Twitter, I don't call it X, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We're not on Blue Sky yet, but keep an eye out. We're also not on TikTok, but most of the places.
Or you can send us an email at sbtcpodcast@religionnews.com. That's like Saved by the City. So sbtcpodcast@religionnews.com. We want to hear from you.
So let's talk about, and this is something I have struggled with discussing about this book and just kind of discussing about purity culture in general in my writing work about this culture. I think something that you have done and some of your colleagues have done at Bare Marriage has been very helpful in terms of teaching a lot of women about the dangers and the adverse effects of purity culture. And your research has shown the impact this has had on women. And I think that's very good. And I'm grateful that work is starting to reach a wider and wider audience because of the work that you've done. I think less well understood and a little bit harder, at least for me to talk about, is the impact that purity culture has on men and the adverse effects that it has. And it can feel a little bit maybe selfish sometimes to discuss this because obviously I do think the impacts on women have been far more detrimental and harmful on women than it have been on men because purity culture is designed to protect men and to lift up men and to provide for men's own sexual gratification. But it hasn't even succeeded at that, and in fact has been hugely harmful to this sort of talk. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about what you've seen in terms of how this not only hurts women, which we know it does, but how it has hurt and set back men as well who take this advice.
Yeah. And I've got some numbers on this too that I can give you.
That'd be great.
So we surveyed 20,000 women for the Great Sex Rescue, and we measured how some of the big messages like all men struggle with lust, it's every man's battle, or a wife should have sex with her husband to keep him from watching porn, how those things affected women, lowered orgasm rates, increased rates of sexual pain, lowered marital satisfaction, sexual satisfaction, really, really bad. But we also surveyed men. So we surveyed, I think, about 3,000 men for our book, The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex. And we asked men, because we really, really wanted to drill down on this do all men lust question. Okay, so we said, hey guys, do you have a daily struggle with lust? Right? 75% said yes. So still a lot, not every man though. Sure. 75%, so it's not 100. So they're wrong, it's not every man. But our big question is, are men actually lusting, or are they just feeling ashamed for being heterosexuals and for noticing that a woman is pretty? So we gave guys 5 different scenarios where you might lust. And some of them we took directly from Every Man's Battle. They had one about if you see a woman lean over to put her kid in a car seat, do you lust then? Because they had that. So we gave different scenarios, including some from Every Man's Battle. And then we gave different things that you could do in these cases, from like full blown absolute lusting after her to like just noticing her to it not even registering. And what we found is that of those 75%, pretty much half of them didn't lust in any scenario we gave them, and they were not struggling with pornography. Which makes you wonder, how are they defining lust? And I think what's happened with stuff like Every Man's Battle is that guys feel like, if I notice that a woman has a chest, I have already lusted.
Right. Yeah, I've lost the battle right there.
I've lost the battle. And so the only solution is never to see a woman's chest, never to see a woman's figure. And that's not what lust is. Jesus said, whoever looks at a woman with lust. So you have 2 things going on there. Looking is a deliberate action. It's not just seeing. It's not noticing. It's fixating on someone. And then with lust is with a deliberate mindset, in a way that objectifies her, in a way where you're fantasizing, where you're imagining. There's something more going on than just, wow, she's got a good body.
Sure.
And you think about 12, 13, 14-year-old boys who are just starting to get sexual feelings, starting to get erections when they don't want them, confused about their body, and they hear this message about lust. And they really feel like God is setting me up in a no-win situation.
Yeah.
Like I am just going to be sinning my whole life and there is no way out of this.
Well, that's even very directly in the book. Mm-hmm. It says your maleness is the problem. You are set up as having this incurable, it is something within you. I find this kind of strange because something I see from a lot of the people who espouse this kind of talk is that there is this liberalism that hates masculinity and that hates guys being men, and feminism has made it like just you're just evil to be a man. That's not something I've actually encountered in a lot of the feminism that I've read or people that I've talked to who are academics in these circles. That I don't see that, but it is explicitly the problem brought up in Every Man's Battle. Is maleness is this inherent weakness within you that you will never be able to have victory over, that you may be able to sort of like direct into something, into something that can keep you from like just wanting to die or wanting to give up altogether. But it is something within you that is unbeatable, and it is just being a male.
Yeah, we got there naturally simply by being male. And in Every Heart Restored, they say men just don't naturally have that Christian view of sex. So men were born not to be able to value intimacy. According to them, men were born to sin. That is men's natural way of seeing sex, is that to men, sex is about objectifying women, and men were born to do that. And that's misandry. Or misandry. I don't know how you say it.
I've only read it. Yeah.
But like that is what that is. It's misandry. It's a hatred of men.
They also pit your body as sort of the actual enemy here. It is this body that you're born into, which is true for both men and women. Men in this, women are cursed with a body that is basically a time bomb for any man in their vicinity that they need to cover up and hide, or else it's going to cause a man to go into full-blown objectification at all times. And men are cursed with a body that is actively trying to pull against their own war to be, their journey towards spiritual health and becoming more Christ-like. And both of these, you are just sort of set inside of this vessel, basically, this like physical carcass that is going to keep you from ever really having victory or really having any substantial progress on this. I just remember, I think back to my own experience in youth group when I was hearing these sorts of messages, how painful that is to hear and how defeating that is, and this getting this sort of a, well, then why bother message? Or like, why would I even try? I'm not going to try to fight, especially when you're 14 and you're just like dying all the time. You're you have no idea what's going on with the hormones in your body, and you're being told at the same time, well, it's always going to be like this for you. There's never going to be any real victory over it because you can't escape your own body or your own sort of like physical, chemical urges. And that's a very, very painful thing to hear. And you do see it then continue to manifest in guys, sometimes in very, in dark and dangerous and perverse ways, but sometimes just with guys who are like, well, I guess I can't go to the beach and I can't go to the gym. I can't open up a social media app in public because you never know if I'm going to see, at any one of these places, I may get hit with an attack from the enemy, and then I'm going to die. And it's a hard thing. It's a brutal way to live.
It is. And I've heard from so many women who say, we can't go to the beach because my husband's afraid he's going to lust, and so the family never goes to the beach.
That's really sad.
It is. It's stealing so much from everybody. And I want to stress again, we've already said this, but this really needs to be understood, is that these people were not qualified to write this. And it's really unconscionable that big organizations like Focus on the Family and stuff promoted it, even when they weren't qualified to write it, because they don't offer any solutions that actually work. There are solutions that work for sex addictions. Most of them involve, understanding why you've turned to porn as a self-soothing technique, understanding your shame, understanding the shame cycle, becoming more vulnerable, becoming more open with people in your life. It's a whole bunch of stuff you got to do. You can't just knuckle your way through it. You need to get more authentic and vulnerable in your own life and really examine this stuff, especially with a licensed counselor if you can afford it. But that's not what they offer. And instead, they really have perpetuated this idea that every man lusts, and that is not a biblical message. It isn't. 1 Thessalonians 4 tells us to put lust to death, that this is not supposed to be the story of the Christian life. And it's so interesting because as I've been talking about this ever since The Great Sex Rescue came out, people accuse me of being very anti-man because I don't agree with this message. It's like, yeah, because I think that men are good. I don't think that men naturally objectify women. I don't think that most men want to assault women. I do think that men can be good and that most men are. And the fact that they're preaching this and that so many Christians have adopted it, that's what I find so heartbreaking.
Do you think there's even an element of this maybe where, and we've kind of danced around this, but maybe to make the implicit explicit, where this becomes sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy, where men hear this message and they're like, well, I guess I can't change or do anything about this. So the reason that, or I don't want to say the reason, but maybe part of the reason that we continue to see so many men, particularly in the church and in Christian circles, where there's not a week that goes by where there's not a story of some pastor or some ministry leader who gets caught in some sort of terrible sexual sin, often crime, has been just fire hosing this sort of talk from the time they were probably 12 or 13 years old. And that turns them into a sort of person who just doesn't know how to actually control, and maybe even has had these new urges created or mutated by this kind of literature, by these types of resources that would have otherwise not been, or been far more manageable, because you wouldn't have had read that you can't do anything about this stuff.
Yeah, we did a lot of focus groups in our research, and what we found over and over again was that the men who became Christians in their late teens, early 20s, don't struggle with this the way the guys who grew up in youth groups
That's
do.
Interesting. That's fascinating.
Because they grew up thinking they're supposed to respect women. They grew up with their sisters wearing bikinis, with their mom, with their grandma wearing bikinis. Bikinis just, we're not a big deal when grandma wears them, And then they become a Christian, and they don't understand what all of this is. One woman said in the focus group, so I was talking to my husband about every man's battle, and he said, "Oh, what's that? Sin?" And she goes, "Lust." And he goes, "What are you talking about?" Like, it didn't even cross his mind. But when we raise boys from the very beginning, where it is a sign of manliness that you struggle with lust, and that all men turn to porn, or struggle with pornography, we are creating a problem. And we're also creating this big divide between men and women, because if guys automatically lust, if they are in the presence of an attractive woman, then attractive women are really dangerous. And so guys often can't talk to attractive women, or they don't know how to act. They don't even know how to talk to a woman at all. And I mean, I've had the experience, in evangelical conferences or places where my husband and I have been, where a man will talk to my husband but not even look at me.
Yeah, sure.
Even if I'm the one who can answer a question, they will direct the question to my husband. He'll ask me, I'll answer it. And then my husband, it's absolutely ridiculous. But they won't talk to me. And this is just not the way Christians are supposed to behave. But if we have this objectified view of women, it really does separate the sexes. And it causes a lot of problems. I do want to read one thing that Fred Stoeker said on a Focus on the Family show. Can I?
I'm on pins and needles. Yeah, okay. I can't wait.
So Fred Stoeker was talking about men's purity on Focus on the Family. I think this was in 2017 or something. But he's talking about the problem of purity and that the vulnerability that men have. And he says, our native language of intimacy with a girl is sexual. So when we're with a girl, we're naturally going to want to express that sexually. But the biggest problem is not how much we're pushing on the boundaries of our girlfriends. The biggest problem that this creates in our lives is, and then he goes on to explain how men get visually stimulated and they turn to pornography. So he says, the biggest problem is not pushing on the boundaries of your girlfriends. Do you know what it's called to push on the boundaries of your girlfriends? It's called sexual assault.
Oh, yeah.
Because if you're pushing the boundary, she's said no. She says, I only want you to go this far. And if you go further, you are now assaulting her. But he says, no, that's not the biggest problem. The biggest problem is that, we're tempted by pornography.
Yeah.
So again, it's erasing women from this whole conversation. The impact we have on women doesn't matter. It's just what we do ourselves.
One of the many issues at play here is the idea of consent in a sexual situation kind of came from liberal culture, at least is perceived as coming from liberal culture, from feminist culture. And because of that, it's just sort of inherently not trustworthy or it's kind of associated probably also with like sex outside of marriage or maybe with like even like LGBTQ sexuality. So because of that, consent shouldn't matter to good Christian people. Like we don't take that into account because it's one of those weird liberal things. But obviously, and we know this, but it bears repeating, saying out loud that consent within marriage is extremely important and is a vital part of a healthy sexuality within marriage. But that is not something that is brought up in this book at all. And that is why women are just kind of taught to be like kind of permanently open, like the green, like consent is just always understood to be there. And even if she were to withhold consent or say, I don't want to do this, that's maybe a speed bump, but it's not a stop sign.
Right.
And that's a really ugly way to talk about this. And it's talked about over and over again in this book and the rest of the literature, that came out of it.
Yeah. In Every Heart Restored, they said, we know guys who've coerced their wives into sex 2, 3, 4, even 4 times a day. If your husband is demanding sex more than once a day, that's a problem. So basically, there's a quota for coercion. He's allowed to coerce you into sex once a day, but more than that, that's bad.
I saw some writing about this, and maybe you know more about it than I do, because I could not find an early edition of this book to read. I didn't get the old about. Is it true that in that first one, there was some talk about the 3-day rule?
Yeah. Okay. So we tracked this down.
Okay. I'm curious about this because I read a little bit. I had never heard of this before. I started reading.
You're a guy. Most women
Okay.
know about the 72-hour rule because this is taught widely in books to women. It's taught in women's Bible studies. Like I had heard it, the 72-hour rule that you're supposed to have sex every 72 hours. And like Every Man's Battle talks about it. Sheet Music talks about it. Power of a Praying Wife. All kinds of our literature talk about the 72-hour rule. And we were trying to figure out where this got started when we were writing The Great Sex Rescue. And in Every Man's Battle, they attributed it to James Dobson. And so we went back and we found it. It's in a book from 1978, I think, from James Dobson, What Your Husband Wishes You Knew. And he did not base it on anything.
Out of the clear blue.
Yeah. But all of these Christians took that as gospel. Well, now this is this new rule. And I am not saying that it's bad to have sex every 3 days, okay? Like we did find in general that, when you have sex more often, it's often associated with a better marriage. But sex alone doesn't create a better marriage. It's the good marriage that creates good sex, okay?
Right. Don't put the cart before the horse.
Right. And actually, couples who have sex every day are worse off than couples who have sex less than once a week. So it's like more frequency is better until it's bad, because couples who have sex every day, there's something going on there that's not normal. And it's probably the Every Man's Battle stuff.
Yeah, I've seen online you've been attacked for this or criticized for this as being sort of anti-sex, which is obviously not true. In fact, I'd say, in my estimation, because of your work, you are more pro-sex or pro-sexuality, because in the framework that you and the people at Bare Marriage talk about, it is not just a sort of like a receptacle for all the bad thoughts to get them out of your system once every 72 hours or whatever it ends up being. It is an important part of a good, healthy marriage in which both people can express their love and appreciation for each other, which I think I know the guys who wrote this book would say that's what they think sex should be. I understand that, but nothing about what they've written actually suggests that is important to them or what they consider to be the point or even really a point of sex.
Yep. No, exactly. And I think it's so funny when people say that I'm anti-sex, because like we have an orgasm course, we have a libido course. I've written a book called 31 Days to Great Sex. We have, so many books on how to have great sex. Like it's just that to us, sex is mutual, intimate, and pleasurable for both. It's not using her as a masturbatory aid.
Yeah. And as soon as you start talking about that, a lot of Christian guys get very, very nervous because it sounds like they just, I think still in some way kind of associated with like witchcraft from the 1600s New England. Like it just, because like libido, that sounds like a weird word. It throws them off, and it implies something bigger and grander than just them being able to brag about how often they have sex with their wives. And that's scary to them. Sheila, another part of this is that we usually have the guest give a review to the book of being ApocryFUN or ApocryFoul or some other F word that you can think of. Apocrypha, fine. Maybe keep it a little bit PG, but you can have fun. So would you rate this book as ApocryFUN or ApocryFoul, something else?
I would say definitely ApocryFoul. And to put numbers on it, on our rubric of healthy sexuality, this scored 9 out of 48. So pretty darn foul.
Yeah, that's not passing. That does not make the grid. Okay. Well, I guess it ApocryFlunked.
Oh, that's good. ApocryFlunked. I like it. Yes.
Sheila, I think we're running out of time. Would you mind telling people where they can go find more of your work on this and other issues?
Yeah, so our website is baremarriage.com, so BARE. And you can find our Bare Marriage podcast every Thursday. Our books are there, Great Sex Rescue, Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex, along with our orgasm course and everything else. And there's links on the Bare Marriage page to my Facebook, my Instagram. I'm pretty active on Instagram. So yeah, come on over.
ApocryFUN is a project of Saved by the City and is a religion news service production. Our senior producer is Jay Woodward, and the consulting editor is Paul O'Donnell. We get production assistance from Elizabeth Joy Wyndham and Julia Wyndham.
Chaz Russo put together our look, and Martin Fowler wrote our theme music.
And we are Tyler Huckabee
and Sheila Wray Gregoire.
Win the battle.